I think we're ready to get started. My name is Teresa Chastain. I am President and CEO of Worldwide Interactive Network, which is WIN, and a proud sponsor of Excellence in Action for the second year in a row. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the great debate on academic standards in America and to introduce you to this impressive panel of experts. One thing we can all agree on is that rigorous academic standards will better prepare our students to succeed in the increasingly global competitive economy. An educated workforce will attract the international investment and high-wage jobs that will sustain our standard of living. Simply put, high academic standards equal a high standard of living. WIN, my company, is working in more than 30 states to achieve this effort. For example, we are working with the Oregon Employment Department to provide access to online WIN courseware to every unemployment compensation recipient so they can build their job skills while they're looking for work. In less than 12 months, over 117,000 Oregon job seekers have completed over 84,000 courseware hours. In Florida, we are working cooperatively with the Florida Department of Education, the Workforce System, the Florida Chamber, Associated Industries, and other education industry partners. Over 400 employer partners have joined in our initiative in Florida. We have had more than 125,000 students, job seekers statewide engaged in the program. They've completed over 198,000 courseware hours, which is equal to 22.6 years of job skills training in less than 26 months. Of those participating, 67,000 have received a Florida Ready to Work credential. And most importantly, in looking at the data around the employment wage data, we can see that they have an advantage both in job placement and earnings. The panelists we have assembled here today are going to talk about how high standards are needed to close the international achievement gap, whether it is through a national mandate, through state-by-state initiatives, or the free market. First, we will hear from Chester Finn. He is president of the Fordham Foundation, and he will frame the debate for us. Then we will hear from two researchers. Byron Auguste, director of McKinsey & Company, will share the results of the McKinsey study on the economic impacts of the achievement gap. And Gary Phillips, vice president and chief scientist of the American Institutes of Research, who will share his analysis of America's students compared to their peers around the world. Then we will hear from Mitchell Chester, who is commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Massachusetts is a state who is known around the country for adopting rigorous standards, and he will share the lessons on adopting high standards. Then we will hear from Gene Wilhoit. Gene is the executive director of the Council of Chief State School Officers. He is going to tell us about the Common Core Standards Initiative, which is working to develop high standards for all students in our country. I've been personally engaged in this initiative, and I can tell you it's truly an incredible partnership among the states. And finally, we will hear from Neal McCluskey. He's Associate Director of the Center for Educational Freedom. Neal will share his research on standards developed by states and offer market-based solutions to achieve higher standards. With that, I'm going to turn it over to everyone's favorite education gadfly. Please join me in welcoming Chester Finn.
Teresa, thank you for that, and thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Teresa and your company for being sponsors of this terrific gathering. This session is billed as the Great Debate on Academic Standards in America. This is not fundamentally a pep talk. This is fundamentally a discussion of whether a move toward common or national standards for the United States of America in 2009 is a good and necessary thing to do, a path to perdition, a heavy lift, an important idea. We've got some not only different perspectives on this on the panel, but we also have people who've been involved in very different aspects of these issues. They have good biographies in the program, and so I'm not going to take any more time with additional introductions of them. I am going to say that the topic of Common Core or national or joint, or use whatever adjective you like, standards, is very timely. Gene's organization and the Governors Association published a draft Common Core end of high school standards in math and in reading, writing, speaking, and listening in mid-September. The comment period is still open. I'm told that comments are pouring in. A whole lot of states are invested in at least the development of these standards. By happenstance, my own organization, the Fordham Institute, today published a study called Stars by Which to Navigate, ? Copies of the executive summary are in the back of the room, and in which we evaluate the draft Common Core standards and, incidentally, also PISA and TIMSS and NAEP. So have a look if you like. This is a serious effort to have some constructive feedback on all of these very important benchmarks beyond the individual states. We're going to go in the order in which people are listed in the program. That is, we're going to start with Byron and go on to Mitch, etc. They've each got 5 minutes for opening comments on the stated topic. Then I'm going to ask a few questions. And then we're going to turn to all of you with roving mics, as there have been in the earlier sessions today. And without further ado, let's lead off with Byron.
Thank you. So this is a conversation about standards. And standards are about defining what our children should learn and achieve academically. So I want to frame the question by focusing on achievement, and specifically to focus on the educational achievement gap that we face in our country. Is that better? Okay.
I think so.
Terrific. So I want to focus on the educational achievement gap that we face in our country. This gap is an enormous moral challenge for our nation. But it's also, as some people have alluded to already at this session, it's an economic challenge. McKinsey's recent work assesses the economic cost of the achievement gap, which really consists of 4 gaps, and I want to touch on each of them briefly. So first, the international gap. Relative to our wealthy country peers, our children start off about the middle of the pack, but by the time they reach high school, they fall into near the back of the pack, again, for other rich countries. This slide shows the 8th grade PISA exams in mathematics, where the U.S. is 25th out of 30 OECD countries. But we don't only have a gap in excellence versus our peers, we have an equity gap too. Specifically, we have a gap between students from higher and lower income families that is much more pronounced in the United States than it is in other OECD countries. This graph from the OECD data, the same OECD data as the last, looks at the results on the PISA math exams by socioeconomic status. So the U.S., the United States, is right there in the middle of the graph where the 2 lines cross. All the countries that are higher than us on the graph had their 15-year-olds performing better overall on this in math, and all of those to the left of us on the graph got more equal outcomes across different socioeconomic groups. So 17 out of 30 countries did both. They both did better overall and had more equal outcomes. Just think about that. The United States, which is a country that had a decades-long start in universal secondary education, to which generations of immigrants crossed oceans to seek opportunities for their family. Now, 17 nations have both higher and more equitable results in education, which I think we all agree is the most fundamental basis of opportunity. Besides the international gap, we have a racial gap. By no matter what achievement or attainment measure you use, Black and Latino students perform significantly lower than their white counterparts, with 3 times the share of students that are below basic and about only 1/8 of the share of students that are performing at advanced levels, i.e. the scientists, the engineers, the entrepreneurs of the future. In addition, we have an income gap, independent of the racial gap. 6 times as many low-income students perform below basic on NAEP for grade 4 math, and 4 times as many on reading. This is true for white, Black, and Latino students. The differences on this slide represent about 2.5 years of learning. Fourth, we have a systems gap. Students from the same racial and socioeconomic backgrounds who are in different states of the United States have significantly different performance. So, for example, New Jersey and Connecticut. New Jersey has better NAEP results and a smaller racial achievement gap, despite having lower income per capita and a higher proportion of racial and ethnic minorities than Connecticut does. The difference between those two states is about half a year's learning. Or take Texas and California, two states with very similar demographics. On average, California students, Black, White, and Latino, are 1 to 2 years of learning behind comparable students in Texas. The bottom line is this: systems matter, and one of the big differences in systems is standards. The price we pay as a nation for these 4 achievement gaps is staggering. It's the equivalent of a permanent national recession. So specifically, we adapted a methodology first developed by Eric Hanashek, who I think is here today. And if we looked at, if by 1998, 15 years after the publication of The Nation at Risk, the U.S. had managed to close its international achievement gap, that's the big stack of money that you see. U.S. GDP would have been $1.3 to $2.3 trillion higher than it is in 2008. So that's about 9 to 16% of our national income, or the equivalent of about $3 to $5 billion a day. The other gaps matter too, though. If we had improved Black and Latino performance to that of white students, our GDP would be $300 to $500 billion higher. If we had lifted the scores of students with family incomes of less than $25,000 to the same level as other families, our GDP would have been $400 to $670 billion higher. And if we had increased the scores of students in states below the national average, just up to the national average, not even to the best, U.S. GDP would have been $400 to $700 billion larger. So each of these smaller gaps is between 2 to 5% of our gross domestic product. By comparison, the largest recessions since World War II have seen a drop in output of somewhere around 3%. This latest one, which is a big one, saw a drop in output of about 6% of GDP. So, these gaps, the systems gaps we're seeing among states, if you could close those, that would be as big, almost as big as the current recession. And the international gap would be about twice as big as the effects of the current recession. So where does this leave us? It does not prove, of course, that higher standards are a silver bullet. However, most of the countries that perform better than we do have demonstrably clearer and higher standards, and most of those performing worse than us do not. But standards alone, of course, are not what make those systems work. But there is a great deal of evidence that high expectations for students and then supports to students, teachers, and schools to achieve those high standards and accountability for doing so makes a substantial difference. We need to commit to massively reduce these achievement gaps, and common expectations across systems for all children is an important start. And as we'll discuss here, some commonality among those standards may create a platform to promote some of the innovations that Governor Bush and Chancellor Klein were talking about earlier today. And as we can see, both the moral and the economic stakes of getting it right are very high. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mitchell Chester, pull your mic closer and take it away.
Thank you, Checker. Good afternoon. I want to make a couple of points, but I want to start by saying that if, in fact, this is a debate about academic standards and taking this on as a multi-state, cross-state initiative, I'm on the side of hoping that we succeed in this endeavor, and I'm very optimistic about it. And the gentleman to my left, Gene Wilhoit, is really right in the center of the effort to pull this together. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to make sure that if it doesn't come across that I'm optimistic, I want you to know up front that I'm optimistic about this. So the second point I want to make, just to follow on Byron's comments, Massachusetts arguably is a high-performing state. Whether you compare the results in Massachusetts to other states in the nation, we have recent results, second time that we've participated in the TIMSS assessment, International Math and Science. I think the argument has been made that Massachusetts students outperform students in every other state. Likewise, on the TIMSS, it turns out that Massachusetts 4th and 8th graders perform right up there with some of the top-tier countries, if not right at the top, not far behind that. But despite that, we have pretty substantial gaps in achievement. So there's pretty substantial variation in what's being accomplished. So if you think about, on aggregate, the state results being that strong, the top is doing even better. And I would argue there's a lot of kids in Massachusetts who are getting a world-class education by anybody's standard, but there's a lot of kids who are not. And so I'll put a marker down on that piece. The third point I would make, I'm optimistic. Massachusetts is doing well in aggregate, but a lot of variation. But the third point I'd make before we get too engrossed in the discussion of standards and assessments, again, because Massachusetts standards are often held up as a benchmark, as a key marker. Massachusetts assessments are often cited as top-notch, as aiming high, as well done. I'm going to argue, and we probably won't spend a lot of time on this today, that as challenging as it is to have strong standards, strong assessments, that challenge pales in comparison to the implementation of those, to seeing those actually driving the curriculum and instruction that all students are experiencing. And for me, that's probably the core challenge in Massachusetts. As I said, with the data, I think that lots of kids in Massachusetts are getting outstanding curriculum and instruction, but lots of kids are not. And I don't think it's our standards per se that are preventing those places where that's not happening from doing better. But on to the national effort, we've put down maybe three, maybe four different touchstones which are critical for us. And again, we were in the process, we in Massachusetts were in the process of refining the standards that we have on the books. We go through a refinement process every 5 or 6 years. That was just at the front end when the national effort was launched, the Common Core effort, and we very deliberately revisited our timeline for this revision to be sure that we were indexing our efforts to the Common Core efforts, because we do hope that there'll be a lot for us to learn, a lot for us to gain from the Common Core efforts, and so we will not complete our revision process until we see the outcome of the Common Core process. There's a couple of pieces. One of the pieces that we've put on the table is that for this to be worthwhile, for this effort to be worthwhile, it needs not only to be to identify college and career ready, but it also has to be internationally benchmarked. I mean, this in my mind is a phenomenal opportunity for the United States, with states taking the lead in defining what I would call an American competitiveness agenda. And so if we do this process well, but we only look within our borders and we don't do the international benchmarking, it'll be a tremendous opportunity loss. So we're pushing very hard to make sure that the effort looks at international benchmarking. We also are pushing hard on the process of developing these, because the typical process that states or others use to develop standards is a consensus-driven process. It seeks wide input. And we think it's important for this effort that while there's an opportunity for input, and everybody has a dog in this fight, everybody wants to have input into this, it's important that this be evidence-driven around college and career ready, around the internationally benchmarked, and that the writing team gets some insulation. I'm being thrown off the stage here. That the writing team be protected from having to turn out a document that tries to be all things to all people. And our final touchstone is no state at the end of the day should have to compromise on the standards that they have on the books to be on board with the Common Core standards.
We're going to come back to that very point. Thank you very much, Mitch. Neal McCluskey.
I want to thank the Foundation for Excellence in Education for having me here today, and I'm starting to think that perhaps I am here to be the catalyst for the debate up here. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to throw some things out here, and hopefully it makes a lot of people angry, but that there are at least a few people who like it. And I want to start by saying, I want to be very clear that I think public education is not producing what it should. Our students aren't doing well enough, especially in the basic skills that we want them to have. And in particular, we're not doing well enough when you consider the funding that's gone into education. So if you look at the data over the last 3 decades or so, the funding kind of goes up like Mount Everest, very, very steep. But if you look at performance, it's sort of Death Valley, completely flat. And obviously that's not acceptable. And so in light of this, I certainly sympathize. I understand why people want to move to national standards. Because what our local districts have done, what our states have done, too often has not been sufficient. It hasn't been providing good education. Unfortunately, I think the move to national standards is going to make this worse. And there are really four major reasons for this. I'll go to them as quickly as I can so I don't get assaulted by the moderator. The first thing is politics. I mean, one of the problems that we've had, in fact, probably the fundamental problem we've had in local and state control of education is politics. Ultimately, the people who have the most power in politics of education are the people who are employed in education. I mean, their livelihood comes from it. So, of course, they're the most organized and have the highest motivation to affect what happens in education politics. And like all of us, they'd like to get paid $1 billion and not have anyone tell them whether they're doing a good job. And so I don't see how going to further centralization, further top-down political control solves that fundamental political problem. I want to talk a little bit also about whether or not the Common Core state standards that we're talking about will really be voluntary to states. And I don't think they will, and I don't think you can look at the history of federal involvement in education and say that they will. Yes, we'll say that in name, just like No Child Left Behind, you don't have to. No state has to sign on to No Child Left Behind. It's just your taxpayers do have to pay for it, and if you want any of those hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, then you'd better sign on. And already we see the federal government talking about attaching money to Common Core state standards. So the federal government's talked about, well, we'll spend $350 million on tests to go with this. And if you'll sign on, you have a much better chance, wink, wink, of getting Race to the Top funds. And I find it hard to believe that when we get to the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, a major part of it won't be connecting the accountability mechanisms to national standards. I want to say a little bit about the research into national standards, and frankly, it doesn't support national standards. Now, there is research that suggests it might be good, but the research is very thin. What there is in terms of comparative research of countries with and countries without national standards it's inconclusive, and outliers, because you only have a few countries ultimately, the outliers greatly affect what you get, what it reveals about the standards, and once you control for outliers, those countries with standards don't do any better than those without. And it also fails to adjust for things like culture and political changes that are very important but difficult to quantify. I also think we should be a little concerned that if we have a single or a single national standard, we become focused on a few quantifiable things. And I don't want to sound like, a fuzzy 21st century skills guy, but creativity and critical thinking are important. And I think we don't want to lose this. And if we look at the countries that are doing best on these international exams, they typically do a lot worse than we do in terms of economic growth, in terms of measurements of happiness. So it's quite possible they're not getting nearly everything they want out of their education system beyond the test scores that they could. So what's the solution? Well, I'm the free market guy, I think, although other people, I'm sure, love free markets here. But the solution is to fundamentally change the power structure in education, not more top-down, not further centralization where the people the schools are supposed to serve don't have any power. It's move it from the bottom up. Give the money to parents. Make schools responsive, have to be responsive to the people they're supposed to serve. Then you have real accountability. Then you have real competition. And very importantly, you also have innovation, also important. But especially important is you have specialization, because no two kids are exactly the same. All need different things, progress at different paces, and the best way to maximize the educational outcomes for hugely diverse people is let them find the schools that are best attuned to their unique individual needs. And that doesn't come from national standards, that has to come from school choice for all.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to measurements of happiness, because I thought that was only Bhutan. Hey. There are no applause meters in this hall. And there's two speakers who haven't even been heard from yet. Moving right along. Gary Phillips.
All right, I'm going to talk about international benchmarking, why it's important, and give you what I hope is a good example of it. Everyone knows that in the U.S. we perform poorly in international surveys like TIMSS and PISA. What's not widely understood is that not only do students perform poorly compared to other countries, but The educational systems among the 50 states have low expectations, and they have wildly inconsistent expectations. This is because we rely on each individual state to develop its own tests and set its own achievement standards. These achievement standards in almost every case are established without any external referent. There is usually no information about how the state compares to national standards and no information about how the standards in the state are internationally competitive. Often the low-achieving state thinks it's setting a high standard when it's not. For example, if only 20% of the students reach proficient in the state, they might consider that a rigorous standard. However, if that same standard were used in another country, like for example in South Korea, it might be that 90% of the students would reach it. In other words, it is not an internationally competitive standard. No Child Left Behind is complicit in this problem because it encourages each state to set its own standards, but does not require the standards to be internationally or nationally benchmarked. International benchmarking would reduce the variability in the state achievement standards, and like a rising tide that lifts all ships, all the states would be requiring higher standards that are more internationally competitive. So I would like to give you an example of how this could be done by taking advantage of a study done by the National Center for Education Statistics in 2005 called the State Mapping Study. NCES mapped the state achievement standards in each state onto the NAEP scale. Based on a study that I did, a copy of which, by the way, is on the table, called the second derivative, you can take this one step further and map the state achievement standard onto the TIMSS scale. So the NCES study tells you what are the cut points on the NAEP scale that are comparable to the state achievement standard. And what I'm doing here is to show you, by piggybacking on that, what are the scores on the TIMSS scale that are comparable to the state achievement standard. So how do you do this? 4 easy steps. 1, you convert the state test score to the TIMSS scale. 2, you determine the TIMSS equivalent score for the state achievement standard. 3, I relabel the achievement standards on TIMSS so it's easy for policymakers. I call an advanced an A, a high a B, an intermediate a C, and a low a D. And then I report the benchmark grade on the TIMSS scale that is equivalent to the state achievement standard. So let me give you an example of this. Based on the data I have, and by the way, there will be more data coming out from NCES in later this year, about 2007. This is all 2005. These are the results reported to No Child Left Behind for each state in the NCES study. As you can see, the states on the left have high achievement levels, high adequate yearly progress. The states on the right have low. So the highest achieving states, based on No Child Left Behind, are on the left. The lowest achieving states are on the right. I hope you can see this. After I do the benchmarking, I'm now able to determine the grade on the TIMSS scale that's associated with the state achievement standard. Now what you can see here is that the highest achieving states based on No Child Left Behind have the lowest grades looked at from an international benchmarking point of view. On the other hand, the lowest achieving states, for example, Massachusetts there, has the highest standards, which is like a B on the TIMSS scale. What this means is there is a negative correlation in the data between the percent proficient as reported by No Child Left Behind and the internationally benchmarked standards. It's a negative 0.84, which means that the majority of the variation across the achievement among the states, as reported to No Child Left Behind, 70%, is due to the differences in the difficulty of the state achievement standards. For many states, the major way to achieve high adequate yearly progress is to use low achievement standards. We have the same thing here with grade 8. This again is 2005 mathematics grade 8. These are the results reported to No Child Left Behind. Again, the high achieving states are on the left, low achieving states are on the right. Once the state achievement standards are internationally benchmarked, you can see that again at grade 8, the highest achieving states have the lowest standards. And again, what you have is basically the same relationship. You have a strong negative correlation between how well you do as reported to No Child Left Behind and how high the standard is. It's negative 0.79 with the very same result. And since I'm finished before 5 minutes, I should get extra credit.
You do.
All right, thank you.
And if we were having applause, you'd get applause too. Thank you very much. Stop. Gene Wilhoit, how are you going to solve all this?
Well, as all these speakers have dramatically shown, everyone in the room can sense two things, and I think we've come to agreement. One, there's tremendous variability about what a student should know and be able to do depending on geography. I can move from one state to another, and those rules can change dramatically. The second point I think all of us need to acknowledge very directly is that in many of those cases, those standards do not measure up to the standards in other states or to the expectations around the world. So it seems to me, with a number of other variables that need to be addressed in this country, one way in which we can begin to reach better consistency and to raise the expectations is for someone, some set of entity, to begin to address this severe problem. And there are lots of individuals who could take on a leadership role in this enterprise. But I would deposit that in this country, at this time, that should not be the federal government. And there have been attempts, notorious failures in attempts on the part of the federal government to address this problem, and probably appropriately. But because in this country, the authority for education rests in the states, it's incumbent on them to come forward. And so we're engaged in the middle of a process that would call on the states to come together to reach common agreement about what students should know and be able to do in two critical areas of English language arts and mathematics. And I would say that in this effort, we are in the middle of a process that's to be tested, and I think there were three questions, Checker, you wanted me to address in these openings. First,
Yes, sir.
Are these really going to end up in being high standards? After all, these are the same people that are demonstrated on the chart here. Some states who've not set those high standards. I would say in many cases, those were deliberate responses to conditions that were existing in those states. I think in other cases, they were the byproduct of poor processes that were being used. We have said that these standards will meet a new criterion, not what people think are good for their children or what they want for their children in abstract, but they must be college and career ready, under the assumption that all students are going to need further education. Secondly, they must line up with and be equal to the expectations of those in other countries. Third, that they must include the essential knowledge that our students must acquire as students in the public school system. That includes both the knowledge base that is critical and the applications of that knowledge. Now, I think the other important element here is, as Mitch indicated earlier, we have not had a process in this country that keeps us on this diligent course. And the two judgments that were being made in this process are, what kind of evidence do we have that the students who are moving through our system are actually being asked to do those things that result in success at the higher level? One of the things we found out is that there isn't as much evidence in this system as we want, and we're having to make some strong professional judgments. But for the first time, we have created debate in the country about what our students should know and be able to do, and we're asking people to come to the table in a very open process to help us resolve that. But under the assumption that in 2009, it is time to get to this point in our country. We can no longer allow the current situation to continue. So we have built into the system what we think are the insurances that would allow us to get to the high standards. Secondly, are the states going to adopt them once they come out? Although we have 48 states at this point engaged in the process of helping us develop the standards, I'm not naive enough to think that those 48 will stay with us throughout the process for various reasons. But we're going to call on some courageous states to step forward and adopt the Common Core standards. We think we will have a strong cohort to do so. And in that case, we can move this forward, because what happens when you get the commonality of agreement and that commonality is high, you then have the ability to begin to leverage the other important components in the system. Then we can call the question about, are the assessments around those standards appropriate and of high quality? Then we can begin to ask, do we have in place around the system the kind of professional development that needs to be in place? Do we have the kind of challenges and hurdles that need to be addressed by the people inside the system to show that they're delivering a high quality? Then we have an ability to put stronger measures in place around accountability within the structure. So I am confident at this point that we will have a strong cohort that will move forward and will move the action to a much higher level. Third, the question about will these be measurable? We've tried to ensure in the process by putting individuals throughout the various stages in a position to evaluate these standards around clarity. Not only are we looking for high, but we're looking for standards that can be clearly stated, understood by anyone looking at those standards, not in jargon as many of the state standards are today, and that can be translated into assessment measures. It will take a lot of very difficult decisions about assessment design. It will cause us to begin to change, literally, many of the assessment programs that exist in the states today. Many of them are not rigorous enough to meet the kinds of challenges that are going to be put forward in the new standards. It's going to require a lot of courageous people when the system begins to push back to say, this is the right direction to go for the country. We have to hold on to the idea of strong standards, or we will lose our ability to push this system in a systematic way toward strong improvement. The standards are not the absolute, they're not the totality of everything that's going to have to occur. Our sense is, though, that we need this critical baseline of understanding and agreement around what students should know and be able to do to begin to leverage the system toward greater quality.
Thanks very much, Gene. Why don't you keep the floor for just a minute and help the audience with a kind of hypothetical timeline in your head as to where things go from here with respect to finalizing what's in draft and going on to other grades and going on to states beginning to have something to look at and going on to assessments. Unfold this calendar for people a little bit.
It's a pretty aggressive time frame, but we're beginning this process not from a point of no knowledge or no prior history. Remember, we're building off of the work that's been done in the best states. In fact, we put a clause in this because of the person to my right to insist that no state would lower the standards. So we have a basis from the states. We have an international context. We have a lot of good work that's been done over the last few years. So we have on the table now a set of what we're calling indicators of readiness for students who are exiting the system. Those are open for comment. You can get them off our website. We're encouraging hundreds of thousands of people to comment on these, and they're doing so. That's a healthy enterprise in this country.
You sure you want hundreds of thousands?
We're getting there very quickly. And that is the beginning point. That whole conversation today is around, are these standards truly representative of what would represent what a student would know and be able to do to be ready for success in college? Not to get in, but to enter credit-bearing courses and pass those courses with a C or better. That's a very blunt question we've asked higher ed community. That's not the highest standard in the world, but it's higher than most standards in the country today. And it does line up fairly well with other countries. We are now developing those grade-by-grade learning progressions toward those outcome statements that we've established in terms of readiness. We will have on the table a document by January of 2010 for the country to review. And between now and then, again, I would say we encourage all individuals to have input into the readiness document and into those learning progressions, those grade-by-grade learning progressions. We are determined that we, at this point, are going to have something that the country can look back upon and agree upon, at least at this point in our history, about what students should know and be able to do. It will not be perfect. As I said, we have not been diligent about this in our country in the past. We will be in the future. We are setting a process that will call for continual renewal and revisiting of these standards as we move forward and we gather more information. But at least at this point, we hope we've gone through a hurdle that's kept us from making progress in the last few years.
And then the assessment development part, which has not even commenced yet, how long do you imagine that would take before there would be assessments to accompany these standards?
Well, I think, and this may be a point at which some people would say, my goodness, why can't you just do this immediately? But that will probably take 3 years before we actually see a system in place that could support this. And I would say that, just to clarify, most states who have programs in place right now have already developed their assessments for next year. They've gone through all the review against their current standards. The development of the assessments for the following year of 2011 are underway against the existing standards. So the earliest we could see states implementing this would be in 2012, 2013. But that's not bad, because it gives us an opportunity, if we take advantage of it, to create awareness campaign among the public about these new expectations, to build training programs for teachers around them, to begin to design the kind of support structures that we're going to need to assess against those standards.
Gary, based on your long immersion in the world of testing, is that a realistic timetable for new assessments to go with new standards to actually be operational?
I think it is. If it were a state, it would probably be 2 years, but this is the nation, and so 3 is probably about right.
Is about right.
Yep.
So, Mitch Chester, why does Massachusetts want anything to do with this? Tell me again. Everybody who's looked at your standards say they're the best in the country. Why don't you leave well enough alone? What do you have to gain from this?
There's a couple things, Checker. One, first of all, we were in the process of revising our standards regardless. We weren't going to sit pat. That's built into the rhythm of life in Massachusetts, is that we revisit, revise, refine every 5 or so years. That's not uncommon for states. The assumption being that there's always things to learn about what you got right and what you didn't quite get right. And again, I'm hoping that the national effort is going to inform that process for us, and that what comes out of the Common Core effort is going to help inform where we end up in revising our standards. The other, there's a couple other points here. One is that it's really interesting. It's tough to be a prophet in your own land, and being fairly new to Massachusetts, I've been there a little over a year now. Not everybody in Massachusetts is aware and convinced that we're doing well and that we've got it right. In fact, when I talk to legislators, when I talk to the business community, when I talk to the media, with each new round of test results that comes out since in the year plus that I've been there, whether it's our state test, the latest TIMS results, the NAEP, which is going to, again, I've just seen the math, it's going to continue to be news about how well Massachusetts is doing. Each time I deliver those, it's like they're hearing it for the first time. It's really an amazing kind of phenomenon. So having the validation from this Common Core effort, I think, could be hugely helpful to convincing the wide range of folks who have a stake in the Massachusetts system that we are on the right track and working against the right stuff.
Sounds like you may have speedily learning children and slow learning adults in Massachusetts. They haven't looked at Gary Phillips's charts, evidently. Gary, don't let me put words in your mouth, but don't I remember Massachusetts being the only U.S. state that's up there with the Asian tigers on your international comparisons?
Yes, but what Mitch just mentioned, I think, is a common phenomenon. You see it every time NAEP comes out when it compares states, every time the international studies come out and compares nations. The lowest achieving states or nations are the happiest with what they're doing. The highest achieving states or nations are not happy with what they're doing.
So this National Happiness Index that Neal mentioned, maybe we need to revisit it as well. Okay, Neal, let's not talk about Bhutan, though I know they do have an index of gross national happiness. You're clear that you don't think standards should be set nationally, and I have the impression you don't think state governments should do this either. Do you think anybody actually ought to set standards for American schools other than those attending a school? Where, if anywhere, does quality control come in your mind?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And I have a list prepared. Of course, I knew that question was coming. Now, I didn't bring any information to get into happiness research, but if we want to have an impromptu panel on that later, that'd be just fine.
Over drinks, I believe.
Yeah, well, that's when everyone's happiness. But the reality is, markets, free people acting individually, acting with liberty, establish all sorts of standards. So earlier in the day we were talking about, the Governor Bush talked about this, why is it that if you look back at education, right, or if someone from today went back 50 years ago, they'd say, well, this looks pretty much like what we have now, or if someone came to the future, they'd say the same thing. But in almost every other facet of our lives, we see extraordinary change. And it's not that we just see random change that just sort of happens. It's because you have bottom-up standards, you have bottom-up innovation, you have all sorts of things happening from free individuals acting with each other. So let's go back in time a little bit in education. Before there was state control, before there was certainly any federal control of education, back when it was pretty much just based on your home and your church. And we had something called Webster's Spellers and Webster's Dictionaries. And they sold massively, and every American knew them, and they were designed to establish American spellings of things. They were ubiquitous. And they bought them because people generally on their own know, hey, it'd be good if I could talk to my neighbors, and if I could interact with my neighbors, if I could do business with my neighbors. And then you have McGuffey's readers, of course. Now, go to the modern era. Yes, we have very bureaucratic, very top-down controlled public schools. But we still have things that are not mandated, for the most part, by government in our schools that are standards. We have advanced placement, there's International Baccalaureate, there's the SAT, the ACT, Iowa test, Stanford 9 test, all sorts of things. Now, none of them are perfect, certainly. They could all use improvement. We need different measures. But these things exist without having a state standard or national standard. And then go outside of education. Many of you have probably looked at the back of your appliance, maybe you're bored or something, I don't know, but you've seen the little UL listing before, Underwriters Laboratories, ubiquitous. And they are checking on the quality of the things you buy, and they're making money on it. You can talk about franchises. When I go to Starbucks here, it's pretty much the same as Starbucks in Kansas City. It's the same as Starbucks in San Francisco. You have Consumer Reports. You have Road and Track. So standards develop when people have an incentive to set them, and actually when they can make money. Schools, if they could be for-profit, if we could choose them, they could make money. Then someone would make money putting out assessments like U.S. News does and Forbes does in higher education. And I should point out there's also one very personal standard to me, which is that the moderator keeps brutal standards on how long we're allowed to talk for.
So, hush.
And the federal government's not making
Hush.
you do it.
Thank you.
And so with that, I'm done.
Byron, you've talked about the high-achieving countries in the U.S., but do higher-achieving countries actually have national standards? And if so, how did they get them?
Well, I think that so standards are part of what makes, it's part of the picture. And I certainly don't think you can say that standards are a silver bullet. A colleague of mine, Fenton Whalen, did some research into this, published a book, Lessons Learned, How Good Policies Promote Better Schools, looked at this question. He concluded that if you look at it, countries with standards-based examination scored on average 21 points higher on the PISA, which roughly is about a half a year of learning. So that's one thing. If you look at the distribution of those countries that are doing better than us, more of them certainly have standards-based assessments, about two-thirds of them. The ones that are doing worse than us, about 60% don't have those. I don't think that proves that standards are the key, and in fact, there are some very important other factors. Certainly, the quality of teaching and the quality of the entire human capital pipeline system is very important, and I think some of the innovations we'd like to see are very important. But I think one of the things that hasn't been in this discussion so far is the role of standards in those processes as well. So we've talked a lot here about setting higher expectations, which does matter a great deal. If you don't even try, the system's not trying to achieve a high standard, it probably won't. But there's a value in having these standards in achieving both accountability and transparency for everyone. Gary has mentioned something to this regard, that you inadvertently promote a race to the bottom where everyone can set their own standards, because basically you can do better if you just lower you just shrink the yardstick you're using. But also think about how having common standards that are high standards would clarify the effectiveness of schools, of teachers, of all sorts of interventions, of schools of education. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair were able to have a tremendous amount of accountability from the schools of education, the teachers' colleges that were training teachers, because they could see how well each of these institutions, how well their graduates were doing, because there were common standards across the country. And they set up a system whereby the better you did as a teacher's college, the more places you got, and the worse you did, the fewer places you got. We don't have anything like that in this country, because there's just not clarity, because there's not a commonality. And there's lots of examples of that. But the other piece is innovation. It is extremely difficult and expensive and not cost-effective to innovate in most aspects of the education system today, either if you're a for-profit or if you're doing it as a social investment, because it's extremely high cost to develop, and the system is so fragmented that you can't get a decent market size to scale. And that applies to all sorts of things. Teacher training is one thing I mentioned. Professional development for teachers is another. Accelerated learning tools. We heard a lot about personalization and custom. That would be far easier if you had a critical mass of a market that was using the same standards, the same assessments, the same scoreboard. Or, for that matter, testing itself. We've heard about some of the limitations of the test today. If you had a larger market in common, the investments in improving that testing in all sorts of ways, in automating it, in making it richer and more complex, and doing that cost effectively, those investments would pay off. So I think we need to look not just at the static picture of, here's how other countries are doing and how we are doing, but we need to look at the dynamic picture of how are we going to create a platform for real innovation and transformation in education. And there I think common standards could make a difference.
So let me push back just a little bit on that, because you're implying, at least, that common standards will lead to other things becoming more similar across the country. Some people...
I'm actually not implying that they'll become more similar across the country. What I'm implying is that if you have a larger geography and a larger market over which you can measure the effectiveness on a common basis, lots of diversity of innovation will come. I am actually arguing that many more people will be able to try different things and will be able to learn much more rapidly what's working. And so you'll have a market that can actually function effectively, whereas today the market doesn't function effectively in education.
Because it doesn't have a common metric.
Right, exactly.
So you're not suggesting that the common metric leads to, let's say, a lot of people's bogeyman, a common curriculum.
No, I think you'd be able to have much more diversity and competing curricula, and then you'd be able to see which of these were actually working better. But today you can't see which are working better. So that's I think actually you'd have much more, be able to have diversity and competition with accountability if you had that common system.
So, Gary, I know you're a psychometrician, not a political scientist, but do you actually foresee the adoption of common standards having a dynamic effect on states, or will they just continue to look at your charts and say, well, that's where we are, and that's how we compare it to Burundi?
Well, I'm thinking that it would have a dynamic effect. What you have right now is 50 states with 50 different data systems that are not comparable, and it's like if you had 50 horses going out the gate, they all go in 50 different directions. You can't win a race that way. So I think it is important to have common standards. I think when you look around at the rest of the world, most nations do have national standards, which would be the ultimate common standard. And probably common standards will turn out to be a necessary but not sufficient condition. But it is, I think, ultimately a necessary condition.
Gene, you look like there's something you want to say.
Well, I think we're going to have to be very deliberate. And Neal, I want to pick up on some of the comments you made about this system. I'm not under the illusion that by setting common standards we're going to have a changed system, and I think there are lots of other things that have been built in historically that Neal referenced that will need a very direct attention. We're going to need a lot more transparency in the system than we have right now, moving from closed information systems to very open ones that report very directly to the public and engage the public in those activities. I do think that we don't have the kinds of quality options in the system that are being prohibited by historic rules and regulations and conditions that have been established. And so there's going to have to be a deliberate effort to remove those kinds of barriers in the system before we'll see the kind of opening up of innovation that we're talking about. And I do think that we'll have to pay a lot more attention to teaching quality in our schools and the connection between teaching quality and student performance. And we are at a point in our history where that's going to be a major debate. But until we begin to loosen some of those historic controls on the system and begin to address some of the open market kinds of ideas that have caused innovation in the country, I would think that we may have a false promise of something here with standards without the kind of structure to support it.
So Neal said earlier that he sees an inevitable role here for the federal government. Your Gene and the NGA have got this far without the federal government, thanks to energetic membership organizations and private funding. What role, if any, do you see the United States government playing going forward in either the standards part, the assessment part, and or the implementation and alignment of everything else part, or the innovation part, for that matter? I'd like to ask several of you this question because it's on a lot of people's minds. You got this far with the federal government being sort of over to the side. Does it stay that way?
I'm not. There is a temptation on the part of the federal government to engage in this. We've been so conscious and deliberate at this point to keep that separation. But in this country, a part of the education enterprise is supported by federal resources. And so if the current structure continues to exist as we know it, I think it could be a very negative factor in terms of trying to implement what we're talking about. So my sense is that we're going to have to look very seriously at traditional federal programs, how they're disseminated to states, to look at ways in which those programs are supportive of the concepts that we're trying to achieve. And I don't think we're there yet. But so on one level, I think there is a need for greater consistency in federal policy as we move ahead with where we want to go in the states. Secondly, the federal government is a resource. How does one maintain a resource base, a valuable resource base, to do some of the things we want to do without turning this into a federal set of standards? Is a delicate balance we're going to have to watch very carefully.
After a couple other people comment on this, by the way, I'd like to throw this to the larger group. So if you have a question for members of the panel, please organize it in your mind. Mitch Chester, I know you want to comment on this, and I'm going to keep going down the line on this federal government question.
Right. It seems to me that we have we have the potential for an emerging substantial change in federal policy. It's been referenced earlier. I think both Chancellor Klein and Governor Bush talked about a new policy framework whereby the government, federal government, incentivizes aiming high, innovative approaches to get there, not simply spreading the dollars across. I think there's a tension playing out as to whether or not the race to the top really will be limited to those places that demonstrate not only a capacity but a willingness to do the heavy lifting, to aim high in terms of the standards, to measure against them, to design programs that deliver those standards, to take on the human capital, changes in the human capital development systems in their state. So I think there is a role for the federal government, and I hope they stay to that path. I think that's different than centralization, which I think at one point Neal characterized this as heading toward. Having common standards or metrics does not, in my mind, automatically have to lead to centralization. And I think there's probably a theory of action at play here, which will depend a lot on whether or not there's enough of a cohort of states, because this does seem to be primarily a state entry point here, who will sign on, who will find the standards to be the right stuff, who will sign on to developing assessments so there's a common measure across those states. And it's kind of a change process where you don't look for everybody to adopt early. You're going to have some early adopters, and the theory of action would be that if they're successful and show the efficacy of the effort, there'll be others who will then sign on in future stages.
Neal, I'm going to get to you in 1 second, but I can't resist a straw poll of the audience. No names will be taken, nobody will be quoted, and I know nobody has perfect knowledge here. I'd like to know how many of you live in a state that you think 5 years from now will likely be part of a common standards and assessment effort. How many of you live in a state you think will likely be part of a common standards and assessment effort 5 years from now? To my untrained eye, that looks like about a quarter of the room at the present time. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, Neal, have they just Mitch and Gene just confirmed your worst fears?
Well, I don't think I'm going to change what I said earlier based on it. I was actually very encouraged by what Gene said, and I think that I just want to say real quickly that you can't have a market unless you have customers, and we don't really have customers because people pay taxes to a system. They don't control the money, so that's important. But when we get to the federal question, well, we talked about, well, maybe the federal government will just get in the business of incentivizing good action. Well, let's follow that through. So the way the federal government incentivizes things typically is say, if you do this, you get money, right? And so the people's interest is, well, let's do this. Let's get that money. Well, automatically then there is a political stake in what the federal government is doing. And that goes back then to the politics that I talked about earlier. The people who are most motivated and have the greatest organization in education politics are the people who would be held accountable, the teachers, the administrators, on and on like that. And in general, they're like everyone else. They want to get as much money with a little accountability as possible. So the politics then becomes, let's spend as much time and as much effort as we can in Washington to reduce the standards that we're being incentivized to reach so that we don't really have to reach anything and we get as much money as we can. And No Child Left Behind shows clearly how this works. So the federal government said, we're going to incentivize, in fact, we're going to force all states to get all children something called proficiency by 2014. And what was the result? It wasn't states saying, woo, come on, let's really work at this. Let's get everyone to 2014. It's, well, let's lower the standards and we'll call proficiency something that nobody would call proficiency and say we've done it. So I don't see how you have federal government incentivizing something and not have those destructive politics immediately come into play.
So, Byron, for your sins, you work for a very distinguished management consulting firm. I can't imagine that any management consultant would design the education governance system that we have in the United States today, with the interlayering of federal, state, local, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see this push toward common standards and assessments as sorting out any of that for the better?
Well, first of all, I'd say in defense of the governance system in the U.S., it has a proud history. I mean, the way it came about was very authentic because the movement to universal primary education and universal secondary education in particular was a popular movement that in every town wanted to have a high school, and that's how school districts were really born. And there was a time in this country when there was a race to the top. There was a sort of an arms race, and everyone trying to get a great school. And it was a time, and that process, I think, drove a lot of the prosperity of the country. So the legacy we have of these 15,000 school districts and the like, it comes from that. Now, I think when you look at the innovation that we'd like to see in the system, I do think that probably the vast majority of those local school districts lack the capacity to innovate, politics aside. I mean, there are other political barriers and the like. I actually think that what's going to be very important is for states to step up in a big way, and I think this common standards effort is a great one. But states have to step up in lots of other ways too, around teachers and the whole human capital system, around the portfolio of schools and the choices available to people. So I don't actually see that we're going to end up with a primarily national or federal solution in this country, and I don't think we need to. I think there are systems. Canada is an example. Australia is an example. Other federal systems in which the states or the provinces take a much stronger hand than U.S. states typically have. So I think a lot of the management challenge is to have states play a much stronger role in school turnarounds and the capacity to. And I think we're going to hear later from Paul Pastorak in Louisiana, for example. I think the Louisiana Recovery School District is a really interesting example of states building capacity to intervene and turn around failing schools. I don't think you can do that from Washington.
Okay. And Gary, I don't want you left out if you're itching on this one. Otherwise, I'll go to the audience.
Just quickly, I think only the federal government can keep this going, and in fact should. It would not necessarily mean a big change in the federal role in education. Federal government already has a big role in education, collecting information and setting standards and other things. Federal government, there's a lot of variability and flexibility in how the government funds organizational entities already, where it funds them because it's in the public good, but doesn't control them. And so I think only eventual congressional authorization and appropriation in some sort will ultimately get this going and keep it going in the future.
Okay, your turn. I'll peer into the gloom and hope to see a raised hand. We've got wandering mics. Giselle, you can't always be first. Is there anybody else that would like to be first before I call on Ms. Huff? Giselle, we don't have time to go down the lineup with everybody, so direct a question to a particular speaker, please, and bring Giselle the mic.
First, I just want to make one comment, and that is that without the standards, you can't have commoditization. So if you want to commoditize education, which is the only way we're going to get out of this, you have to have standards. But what my question is, and I guess I would ask it of Jean, okay? So you're going to set standards that are higher or better, are going to be at least as good as the best standards we have now, like Massachusetts. And you're going to impose, you're hoping that everybody is going to buy into them, which is very good. But there's an elephant in the room. And that elephant is that no matter what standards you set or what proficiency you hope to get by 2014, you haven't got a delivery system that can meet that.
Is this becoming a lecture or a question?
No, I'm asking the question. What do you do about that? I mean, what do you do about the fact that, people have been trying this since 1983 at least?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm quick to agree with you that standards alone are not going to make the change, and that we've got to incentivize in many other ways a system to change. In fact, in our conversations with the chiefs, we no longer talk about schooling in schools. We're talking about learning for all children. And when you begin to talk about it very differently and begin to talk about a role of transformational leadership as opposed to holding on to rules and regulations, then you can begin to get to the kinds of changes that are necessary. It is a huge and complex set of issues that we need to address because we have a very strongly entrenched and established system that's going to have to be challenged on multiple fronts. But we can't give up on the goal of high achievement for all children. When we lose that compass, then anything seems appropriate. We see at the state level our responsibility to keep that light shining very directly on whether people are obtaining those goals or not. And if not, then there are going to have to be ways that the system moves to try to correct those situations. Equity is a big issue in this country right now. Some people are getting those high quality programs. Too many students are not.
Over by the door. No. All right. Take him a mic. Go ahead quickly, Byron.
Well, I just wanted to add, the delivery system, right, there are many tremendous improvements that are required. But before we get too pessimistic about it, I just want to point out that the reason we've fallen from first in the world by a long distance to somewhere in the middle or perhaps lower than the middle of the pack is not because our system has deteriorated dramatically. It's kind of treaded water for the last 30 years. It's that 20 other countries have dramatically improved their systems and their delivery systems. And therefore, we know that it is possible to do. We know that it's possible to take an education system that is mediocre and turn it into a great system. And we know it's possible to turn one that's failing into a pretty decent system. So I don't think we should get pessimistic about being able to make those changes in delivery.
Over by the door.
Gary Huggins from the Commission on No Child Left Behind for Gene Wilhoit. Gene, I'm wondering if you're concerned, sort of a practical question as we move toward setting higher standards and higher targets, if you're concerned that there be a letdown on the accountability we have now as required by NCLB, or sort of a pushback that as we move toward higher targets, certainly we can't continue to keep score and have accountability for results as we go. And after we get that higher target, do we continue with, again, accountability for producing results, or is it just sort of window dressing, setting targets?
Yeah, I'm pretty positive that the country is anchored in on accountability, and I would hope no one would back away from it. I think what is in question is, do we have the right accountability structure in place right now, or are there improvements? Clearly, we know that this kind of change, it takes time, and that measures need to be much more robust than the ones we have in place right now, both in terms of the form of assessments that are being used with our students, and also in terms of the number of those assessments. We also know there's a major disconnect between the state assessments and local practice, so much closer tie to that. But I think all those changes or improvements I would hope would be made in the system will still be under a very strong regime of accountability. I don't see the country slipping back dramatically. This idea of a performance-based system, I do think there will be a strong effort to try to identify some ways that we can measure not only the take a periodic count of status of achievement, but also begin to push everyone toward an improvement target and begin to measure performance over time. So I'm pretty confident that everybody at this point is ready to take a very hard look at whether those measures are the right ones to get us to a strong accountability system. I think at this point there's kind of a disconnect between those two. I think a lot of people believe that the measures we have today are producing a high quality accountability, but I think in actual practice we could do a much better job.
Yes, sir.
Yes, hello. My name is Howard Leonhardt. I am chairman of the Entrepreneurship Party. I can tell you that us entrepreneurs really believe Neal McCluskey's way is a better way. What I'd like to bring to the panel is that what we feel is that
this is going to turn into a question.
Too much mind on the matter and not enough on the spirit. The number one problem seems to be the boredom of our students. We want to create more Steve Jobs. I've heard a lot of discussion about standards. What about reaching the passion and the heart of these students? Do you really believe standards are the best way to reach the passion and heart of these students and get them engaged and enthused and energized?
Who believes? Which of you would like to respond to the reaching the passion and the heart and the motivation of students question? Mitch, go right ahead.
I mean, I think engagement of students and academic engagement, intellectual engagement is critical, and it's not happening in enough classrooms and enough schools. Absolutely. I don't believe that standards is the issue. I don't think standards is the solution necessarily, but you know, I do think that in too many classrooms, too many schools, kids are just not actively engaged intellectually. And there's some really interesting research, survey research, when you ask students at the secondary level for their perceptions of what they're experiencing in school. It turns out that one of the dimensions that's really critical is whether or not students believe that they're being treated as academically capable and supported to reach high standards.
Question there.
I have a question about the...
And you are?
Well, actually, I'm from Portugal, Francisco Sousa. And we have a debate there about standards also. And I'm a strong believer you got to have standards and accountability. But I really can't put that together with a focus on the student. And there I would have to agree with Neal. So what I'm asking is, shouldn't you put a stop to the age? Is the right age to have equal standards for everybody 15, 18, 21? Because we know it isn't at 25 because people have different degrees and they're good in different things. Shouldn't we stop with the same standards, say 8th grade, and then not anymore because there are surely different pathways to follow? Or should we go on until the 11th grade and the 12th grade? But there, maybe Neal is right.
I assume that Gene and his colleagues had a reason for starting with 12th grade or end of high school. Do you want, as opposed to some other grade? Then Mitch.
A definite decision on our part that we would begin with what were those expectations upon leaving the system, because right now there is in too many cases, no connection between those exit expectations and the future challenges that these students are going to face. And we have ample evidence that we're not making those direct connections to college preparation through the number of remedial courses, up to 60% in our community colleges and 20 to 30% in our four-year institutions, and in terms of the dropouts out of the system. So we began there, but then our thought is that you need to do more than that. You can't wait at the end of that experience to begin to determine what students should know and do. And so there are some ways to begin to articulate what it would take as a prerequisite set of knowledge and skills to reach those ultimate goals.
Go ahead, Mitch. And then bring a mic here, please. Somebody.
Just to punctuate what Gene said, again, Massachusetts, data from Massachusetts, highest performing state, high standards, tough assessments. 37% of our high school graduates who go on and matriculate in public campuses in the state end up getting placed into non-credit bearing courses in either math or in English language arts, or both.
Wow. So, somebody there with a mic with a question? Then you're going to be next and last. So somebody bring a mic up here to her now. Yes.
Hi, I'm Megan Allen. I am a teacher in Hillsborough County. I'm also the Florida Teacher of the Year. And I guess this one's going to Gene. Thank you.
You're picking on Gene, too.
I'm picking on Gene again. Yeah. I'm just curious about teacher feedback with these national core standards and the family feedback, the parent feedback. What kind of feedback have you gotten so far? What kind of trends are you seeing?
Very diverse. All the way from that our kids aren't going to college, so why do we need high standards, to this is exciting work and it's about time. But there's been a tremendous volume of teacher interaction, both in organized forums that we've conducted with those teachers and through individual comment. I would say overall that most teachers are saying to us that this seems to be kind of a fairness issue for them, that basically it is about time that we begin to state very clearly what our expectations are, rather than having us guess what our expectations would be. So we've had, I think, overall very positive results, but I don't want to paint the picture that that's unanimous. We have lots of other divergent points of view.
If you know the answer to this question, roughly what fraction of the comments that have come in to now have been from teachers or parents as opposed to organizations?
I don't.
Okay.
But I could tell you that there are more individual responses than there are organizational ones.
More individual responses than organizational responses. And just to remind everybody, your comment period is open till, is it the 21st?
2 more weeks, yeah.
2 more weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it'll open up again later on when we get the grade-by-grade progressions.
So the comment period on the end of high school draft standards is open for 2 more weeks if you would like to check them out and comment yourself or others in your states. And then another round of comment will follow when they have a draft of the earlier grade standards, recommended standards for the earlier grades. Yes, ma'am.
Checker, I will get to a question, all right? But first,
And you are?
Jane Cunningham, sorry, Senator from Missouri, the Show Me State. Gene, I was really encouraged by your comments, particularly with your concern that will we have the structure in order to support the standards? Giselle was saying kind of the same thing. What about our delivery system? Mm-hmm. Missouri is a state that started high standards many years ago, and I think we're a picture of just that question. Because, number one, we are not reaching our standards in our state. A lot of our schools are being labeled not meeting the adequate yearly progress, yet you compare us internationally, and thank you for those charts, I appreciated it, and we look really good. Back to you, Byron. We're not coming out with innovative ideas after years of this. So then I look at the question of what is happening internationally that is making them achieve so high and us wanting to match what they're doing. And Mayor Norquist of Milwaukee stated this one time, and I want to verify it, maybe some of you know. He said, of all the industrialized countries in the world, of all of them, there is only one that does not give their parents the freedom to choose the school that best matches the needs of their children. Only one that does not give the freedom. America. Is that the truth? And if that's a delivery system that's working, then how do we get there?
That was a whole bunch of questions, and interspersed and salted and peppered with a few comments from Missouri. Let me use that as the occasion to invite everyone both to respond to Jane Cunningham and to make any closing comments you'd like, because we are running out of time. So let's take it right down the line. Byron, would you care to respond or say anything else?
Well, I would say, why don't I just pick out the innovation point that you brought up? And I think that if there were a set of states, Missouri included, and it doesn't have to be all 50 states, but a critical mass, I think that had that common standards and assessment where there was a clarity and that was connected to common data systems and the like, I think you would see, and there's some other policy changes you'd probably want to go along with that, but I think you would see the opportunity for a lot of innovation in the way teachers are trained, innovation in the technology brought to the classroom, and I think it's incumbent on policymakers to then, in that situation, to also reduce, as was mentioned before by Gene, reduce some of the regulations that stop us from trying new things, because I think what you want is you want to be able to try new things, but then you want the clarity of what's working, so that those things that are working, others can adopt, and things that are not working, others you can stop doing. And our system is not actually very good at stopping doing things that are not working, and it's also not good at adopting new things and scaling them up. So I do think this is part of the answer, and I applaud Gene and his colleagues for what they're doing.
Gary?
Just one final thing is that this obviously is an historic and important activity that's going on now, and my hope is that as this progresses, that states will look beyond their borders when they're setting standards and determining what they should expect of students, and not just beyond their borders within the United States, but across the sea as well, and learn from those countries that are doing well.
Incidentally, let me remind everybody, the international panel is the dinner session this evening with Governor Bush, so you may want to come back with that in mind, too. Mitch Chester.
Probably 2 points. One is a comment that's been made a couple of times, including by the senator. Again, in my opinion, getting the standards right is easy. Getting the assessments right is easy compared to building the system that delivers day-to-day curriculum and instruction commensurate with those aspirations in every classroom across a state, let alone a nation. That is the major challenge. Second point is, again, I'm going to finish where I started. I'm optimistic. I'm pulling for this to be successful. I think it's critical for Massachusetts that we not be complacent. Other nations, other states are working hard to elevate what they're providing for their own children, and we need to be right on the cutting edge of that. So I'm very optimistic and hopeful for this endeavor.
Gene Wilhoit.
When I look at the work around the world, other countries, the differences I see are a deliberate and thorough and continuous effort to support a professionalism of teaching. I don't see that strong commitment in the United States as we look generally across the states. That is defining very clearly very high standards for students, assuring that teachers are teaching to those standards, and making sure that then the system adjusts when students aren't getting the kind of learning they need. And that adjustment is, part of that would be choice. No parent should be forced to continue to send their child to a school that's underachieving. We have to face that very directly, and that will take courage on the part of a legislator to make sure the state moves in that direction.
And from the panel's far left, Neal.
Really, it's only physically. In answer to your question, I don't know whether every industrialized country does, but most industrialized countries have more choice than we do. I think it's important. I'm going to make two more points. I think it's important that we, even though most countries that do better than we do have national standards, so do most that don't. And I mentioned earlier that the research is kind of inconclusive on this. I think it's important to note that cultures often have a very big impact. And cultures can often have, especially in East Asian countries, which seem to do the best, a long history of centralization and a long history of focusing on particular exams. So we have to be careful about what we read into national standards test results. And also, I'm going to do a little plug for Checker's organization. They have this new report out, Stars by Which to Navigate. They give the PISA test a very low mark, and that's what we were looking at on these slides. So we have to know what the tests say. But finally, I would just cap it all with, you have standards when you have free people in a free market acting together. They have to establish standards, but they do it with not static standards, but dynamic standards, with innovation, with standards that can change as the times change. And they have real specialization, real innovation, real power. And it always happens. And that's why almost everything else 50 years ago, unrecognizable. School, exactly the same thing. So choice is the fundamental reform, and standards don't help that.
Want to join me in thanking a great panel?